Hollywood coroner says an overdose of narcotics, police say possibly heroin, is responsible for the death of the well-known rock singer Janis Joplin. Miss Joplin was found dead in her bedroom last night. He was 27 years old.
They called him the Lizard King. They called her the Queen of Rock and Roll. On paper, Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison should have been the perfect pairing, two of the loudest, most dangerous voices of the 1960s, both burning at the same reckless speed toward the same tragic ending. But behind the myth of a wild rock and roll romance was something far uglier, a woman who came to despise one of music's most worshipped icons, and who had every reason to. This is the real story of why Janis Joplin couldn't stand Jim Morrison, and why, decades later, her anger looks less like diva drama and more like a warning nobody wanted to hear. Long before she ever stepped foot on a stage with the doors anywhere nearby, Janis Joplin had already spent a lifetime being told she didn't belong. Growing up in Port Arthur, Texas, in the conservative 1950s, she was an odd fit from the start. A girl who loved blues records instead of pop songs, who spoke out against segregation in a town that didn't want to hear it, and who paid for her difference in cruelty. Classmates mocked her skin, her weight, her clothes. At the University of Texas, a fraternity infamously voted her ugliest man on campus, a joke so vicious it followed her for the rest of her life. That kind of rejection does one of two things to a person. It breaks them, or it forges something unbreakable. For Janis, it became fuel. She turned her pain into a voice that sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass, raw, cracked, and utterly fearless. By the time she found her way to San Francisco and joined Big Brother and the holding company, she wasn't just performing the blues, she was living them on stage, night after night, in front of crowds who had never heard a white woman sing with that much unfiltered ache. But surviving cruelty doesn't make a person immune to it. If anything, it made Janis sharply attuned to it, able to spot a predator, a hypocrite, or a bully the moment she met one. And she would meet one soon enough, in the most unlikely of settings. By the late 1960s, Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison were both enormous stars, but they had never really spent time together. That changed when Paul Rothchild, the producer behind both The Doors and Janis's own recordings, got an idea. Why not introduce the two biggest names in the counterculture and see what happened? He arranged a low-key gathering at a house in Hidden Hills, just outside Los Angeles, imagining a kind of summit meeting between rock royalty. For a little while, it actually seemed to work. Both Janis and Jim showed up sober, which was rare enough for either of them. They talked, they laughed. There was a spark of real curiosity between two people who had spent their whole careers being misunderstood by everyone around them. It's easy to see why Rothchild thought he'd struck gold. But the night didn't stay that way for long. As the drinks came out, Morrison began to change. Those who knew him well recognized the shift immediately. The same transformation friends and bandmates had watched happen dozens of times before. The charismatic poet gave way to someone reckless, aggressive, and impossible to reason with. Rothchild himself later described watching Morrison curdle from magnetic to repellent within the space of an hour. Janis, for all her own reputation as a hard drinker, wasn't the same kind of drunk. Where alcohol made her warm and loud, it made Morrison volatile. As the evening wore on, his attention toward Janis stopped feeling like flirtation and started feeling like pursuit, the kind that doesn't take no for an answer. Witnesses at the party described Janis growing visibly uneasy, trying to put distance between them, only for Morrison to close it right back up, as if her discomfort were part of the game. Eventually, Janis had enough. She headed for the station wagon she used to get around, her own version of an escape hatch, ready to leave the whole mess behind her. Morrison wasn't ready to let the night end. He staggered after her, and in a final act of drunken aggression, grabbed a fistful of her hair. That was the moment everything changed. Janis Joplin did not scream for help. She did not wait for someone to intervene. She reached for the nearest object within arm's reach, a bottle of Southern Comfort, the same drink that had become something like her personal trademark, and swung it directly into Morrison's head. The bottle shattered. Morrison went down, dazed and bleeding, while a party full of stunned onlookers tried to process what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't stage theatrics or rock and roll folklore dressed up for effect. Multiple people who were actually there, including Rothchild, recounted some version of this same story for years afterward. It became one of those legendary backstage tales that gets repeated at parties, usually played for laughs. But there was nothing funny about it to Janice. For her, it wasn't an anecdote. It was self-defense. What makes the story even more unsettling is how Morrison reacted afterward, or rather, how little he seemed to register what had happened. According to Rothschild, Morrison showed up to rehearsal the very next day still asking about Janice, calling her terrific, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he'd been the one to cause the entire incident. To him, it was just another chapter in his ongoing legend of chaos. To Janice, it was a line that had been crossed, one she would never forget or forgive. The Hidden Hills party wasn't an isolated data point. It fit a pattern that people close to Morrison had been quietly aware of for years. Judy Huddleston, who dated Morrison on and off for roughly 4 years, later wrote about the relationship in her memoir, describing a man capable of real tenderness one moment and frightening volatility the next. Pamela Des Barres, a well-known figure in the LA rock scene of the era, has spoken about Morrison slapping her without warning or explanation. John Densmore, Morrison's own bandmate and drummer in The Doors, has described witnessing Morrison's temper spiral out of control with women on more than one occasion. None of this erases what Morrison meant to music, the poetry, the raw stage presence, the songs that still define an entire era. But it does complicate the myth. For decades, his volatility was treated as part of the aesthetic, the tortured genius, too wild to be tamed, too brilliant to be held accountable. Janis Joplin, on the other hand, was never given that same grace. Her drinking, her outbursts, her unfiltered personality were treated as flaws to be pitted rather than genius to be celebrated. She saw that double standard clearly, and it infuriated her, not just because of what happened to her personally, but because of what it represented about how the entire culture around her operated. After Hidden Hills, Janis made her feelings about Morrison unmistakably clear to the people around her. She wasn't interested in performing forgiveness for the sake of rock and roll camaraderie. She didn't collaborate with him. She didn't seek him out. Friends who knew her in those final years say she rarely even brought his name up voluntarily, and when she did, there was no warmth left in it. It's worth remembering that Janis Joplin, for all her outward toughness, spent her entire life fighting to be taken seriously in spaces that treated her as an outsider, first in Port Arthur, then in Austin, and later in an industry that still expected women to be smaller, quieter, and easier to manage than she ever intended to be. Morrison, to her, wasn't just one bad night. He represented an entire system that excused men's worst behavior as artistic mystique while punishing women for daring to have the same excesses, the same temper, the same wildness. Janis Joplin died in October 1970, only 27 years old, joining a devastating list of musicians lost at that same age. Her final album, Pearl, released after her death, remains one of the most celebrated records in rock history, proof of an artist who was still growing, still evolving, right up until the end. Her voice, cracked and defiant, continues to resonate with anyone who has ever felt like they didn't fit the mold they were handed. The story of that night with Jim Morrison isn't just rock and roll trivia anymore. Viewed through today's understanding of how women navigated fame, power, and predatory behavior in the music industry, it reads less like a wild party story and more like an early, unmistakable act of self-defense from a woman who refused to be anyone's victim. Not in Port Arthur, not in Austin, and certainly not at a party in the Hollywood Hills. Janis Joplin spent her whole life being underestimated. That night, with a broken bottle of Southern Comfort in her hand, she made sure at least one person never underestimated her again.